The rain hammered against the cracked windows of the tiny apartment where Asher Moon sat hunched over a pile of medical bills, his fingers trembling as he tried to make sense of numbers that refused to add up no matter how many times he rearranged them. 20 years old, and he felt like he had lived 100 lifetimes already, each one harder than the last. The fluorescent light above him flickered intermittently, casting shadows across the papers that screamed of debts and deadlines and a little brother whose life hung in the balance of money Asher simply did not have. Felix lay sleeping in the next room, his breathing shallow and labored even in rest. At 12 years old, he should have been playing soccer with friends or complaining about homework or doing all the normal things that normal kids did. Instead, he spent most of his days too weak to leave his bed, his body betraying him in ways that no child should ever have to experience. The doctors had explained it in complicated medical terms that Asher barely understood, but the essential truth was simple and cruel. Felix needed an operation that cost $1 million, and without it he had maybe 3 months left to live. 3 months. 90 days. 2,160 hours to somehow conjure up an impossible amount of money from thin air. Asher worked 3 jobs and still it was not enough. He started his mornings at 5:30 at a coffee shop downtown, making lattes and cappuccinos for business people who never looked him in the eye and rarely said thank you. From there he rushed to a bookstore where he shelved novels and textbooks until early evening, his feet aching in shoes that had worn through at the soles months ago. And then, when most people were settling in for dinner with their families, Asher grabbed his delivery bag and spent the next 6 hours racing through the city on his beat-up bicycle, bringing food to people too tired or too rich to cook for themselves. He usually crawled into bed sometime after midnight, only to wake up a few hours later and do it all over again. Tonight was a delivery night, and the rain was making everything harder. Water soaked through his thin jacket and dripped down his neck as he pedaled through puddles that splashed dirty water up his legs. His phone buzzed with the next delivery address and Asher's heart sank when he saw it. Blackwood Manor. Even people who had never been there knew about Blackwood Manor. It sat on the highest hill in the city like a dark crown, all stone walls and iron gates and windows that seemed to watch you even when no one was home. The man who lived there was even more infamous than his house. Dante Blackwood, billionaire, alpha, and according to every rumor that circulated through the city, completely heartless. Asher had never met an alpha before, not really. Oh, he had seen them from a distance, had caught their powerful scents on the street and felt that instinctive Omega reaction to duck his head and move quickly past. But Omegas like Asher, poor and unconnected, existed in a completely different world from alphas like Dante Blackwood. Their paths were never meant to cross. Yet here he was, standing at the massive front gates with bags of expensive food growing cold in the rain, pressing the buzzer and hoping desperately that someone would just take the delivery so he could leave. The gates swung open with a mechanical groan that sounded almost alive. Asher walked up the long driveway, his shoes squelching with each step. The mansion loomed larger as he approached, its windows glowing with warm light that somehow made the building look even more unwelcoming. He could hear music and laughter from inside, the sounds of a party where people had enough money to forget that others were suffering just miles away. A stern-looking woman in a black uniform opened the door before Asher could knock. She looked him up and down with obvious disapproval, taking in his dripping clothes and worn-out appearance. She did not speak, just gestured impatiently for him to follow her inside. Asher tried to protest, tried to explain that he could just leave the food at the door, but she was already walking away and he had no choice but to hurry after her, leaving a trail of water on marble floors that probably cost more than his entire apartment building. The inside of Blackwood Manor was exactly what Asher had imagined and somehow worse. Everything gleamed with wealth. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings painted with elaborate scenes of battles and conquests. Paintings in gold frames lined the walls, portraits of stern-faced people who seemed to judge Asher as he passed. The woman led him through a maze of hallways until they reached a massive dining room where at least 30 people in expensive suits and glittering dresses stood around talking and laughing, champagne glasses in their hands. Asher felt every eye turned toward him. He knew what they saw. A soaking wet Omega delivery boy who clearly did not belong in their world. Heat crept up his neck and he ducked his head, focusing on the bags of food in his hands and trying to remember where he was supposed to put them. The woman pointed to a long table against one wall where other food was already arranged in perfect rows. Asher hurried over, desperate to set down his delivery and escape. That was when everything went wrong. His wet shoes slipped on the polished floor. He stumbled, arms pinwheeling as he tried to catch his balance. The bags flew from his hands. Time seemed to slow down as Asher watched in horror as containers of food arced through the air, spinning end over end. They landed with a spectacular crash directly on top of a stack of papers spread across a small side table, covering them in orange juice and noodles and sauce. The room went completely silent. Even the music seemed to stop. Asher stood frozen, unable to breathe, staring at the disaster he had just created. And then a voice cut through the silence like a blade, deep and cold and absolutely terrifying. "What have you done?" Asher's head snapped up and he found himself looking directly into the eyes of Dante Blackwood. The Alpha stood on the other side of the ruined table, and Asher's first coherent thought was that the rumors had not prepared him for the reality. Dante was tall, easily over 6 feet, with black hair that fell across his forehead and eyes that were an unnatural silver color, like moonlight on metal. He wore a black suit that probably cost more than Felix's entire medical treatment, and he radiated power in a way that made Asher's Omega instincts scream at him to run or submit or both. But it was Dante's scent that hit Asher the hardest. All alphas had strong scents, but this was something else entirely. It filled the room like smoke, dark and overwhelming, the smell of winter storms and expensive cologne, and something wild that made Asher's knees go weak. He had to fight the urge to drop to the floor right there in front of everyone. Dante moved around the table with frightening speed, and suddenly he was standing right in front of Asher, so close that Asher could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Those papers," Dante said, his voice low and dangerous, "were contracts worth $50 million. They were about to be signed tonight. And you have destroyed them." Asher could not speak. His throat had closed up completely. He could only shake his head back and forth, eyes wide with terror. This could not be happening. This could not be real. "Answer me," Dante commanded, and the alpha power in his voice forced words out of Asher before he could stop them. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to, my shoes were wet and I slipped, please, I'm sorry." The words tumbled out in a rush, desperate and pathetic. Asher hated how weak he sounded, but he could not help it. He was facing down an apex predator, and every instinct in his body was telling him he was in serious danger. Dante's eyes began to glow with a red tint, a sign that his alpha nature was rising to the surface, fed by anger. "Sorry? You think sorry fixes this? Do you have any idea who I am? What you have cost me?" "Please," Asher whispered, and he felt tears beginning to form in his eyes. "Please, I'll pay for it, I'll work for free, I'll do anything, just please don't hurt me." Something flickered across Dante's face at those words, something that might have been surprise or confusion, but it was gone too quickly for Asher to identify. The Alpha leaned closer, and Asher realized with growing horror that Dante was scenting him, drawing in deep breaths of Asher's Omega pheromones. Dante's expression changed. The anger was still there, but now there was something else too, something hungry and intent that made Asher want to bolt from the room. "You are in heat," Dante said, and it was not a question. Asher's blood turned to ice. No, that could not be right. He had been so careful to track his cycles, to make sure he was never in public during his heat weeks. But as soon as Dante said the words, Asher felt the truth of them. The slight fever he had been ignoring all day. The sensitivity of his skin. The way Dante's scent was affecting him far more than it should. He was entering the early stages of heat, and he had been too exhausted and stressed to notice the signs. "I didn't know," Asher stammered. "I swear I didn't know, I would never have come here if I had known, please, I'll leave right now." But Dante's hand shot out and grabbed Asher's wrist, holding him in place with a grip that was firm but not quite painful. "You will not leave," the Alpha said. "Not until we have discussed what you are going to do about the mess you have made." Dante dismissed the other guests with a wave of his hand. They filed out reluctantly, clearly disappointed to miss whatever was about to happen. The woman in the black uniform was the last to leave, closing the doors behind her with a soft click that sounded terribly final to Asher's ears. Now they were alone, and Asher had never felt more vulnerable in his entire life. Dante still held his wrist, still stood close enough that Asher could count his eyelashes if he had the courage to look up. The Alpha's scent wrapped around him like chains. "Tell me your name," Dante commanded. "Asher Moon," he managed to whisper. "And why, Asher Moon, should I not call the police right now and have you arrested for destruction of property and trespassing?" The mention of police snapped something loose in Asher's chest, and suddenly all his fear transformed into desperate panic. If he was arrested, who would take care of Felix? Who would earn money for the operation? His little brother would die alone in a hospital bed, and it would be all Asher's fault. "Please don't," Asher begged, and now the tears were falling freely down his face. "Please, I have a little brother, he's sick, he's dying, I'm the only one who can take care of him. Please, I'll do anything at all, just please don't call the police." Dante stared at him for a long moment, those silver eyes boring into Asher like they could see every secret he had ever kept. Then slowly the Alpha released his wrist and stepped back. He walked over to a chair and sat down, crossing one leg over the other in a posture of absolute control. "Anything?" Dante repeated, and there was something dark in his tone that made Asher's stomach clench with dread. "Yes," Asher said, because what choice did he have? "Anything." Dante was quiet for what felt like an eternity, studying Asher the way a scientist might study an interesting specimen under a microscope. Then he spoke, and his words shattered Asher's world into pieces. "Your brother is sick. You said he is dying. I assume he needs expensive medical treatment that you cannot afford?" Asher nodded mutely. "How much do you need?" $1 million, Asher whispered. "For an operation. Without it he has 3 months to live." "I see." Dante steepled his fingers together. "And you are an unmated Omega currently entering heat with no Alpha to help you through it." Asher felt his heart hammering so violently against his ribs that he thought it might crack right through his chest as he stood in Dante Blackwood's study, still dripping rainwater onto the expensive carpet while the Alpha's silver eyes assessed him like he was a puzzle that needed solving. The proposal Dante had made hung in the air between them, impossible to ignore and equally impossible to accept, yet Asher knew with a sinking certainty that he was going to agree to it anyway because Felix was dying and nothing else mattered except keeping his little brother alive. Dante had offered him everything. $1 million for Felix's operation, plus an additional $5 million that would ensure both Asher and his brother would never have to worry about money again. In exchange, Asher would spend one night with Dante, would allow the Alpha to claim him during his heat, and then they would part ways forever as though nothing had happened. It was a devil's bargain, the kind of deal that Asher's mother would have warned him about if she had still been alive, but desperation made people do things they never thought possible, and Asher had long since passed the point of having any other options. The agreement was made with few words. Dante provided papers that Asher barely read through his tears, legal documents that promised the money would be transferred immediately to Felix's hospital account. Asher signed with shaking hands, his signature looking like the scrawl of a drunk person, and then Dante made a phone call, and just like that Felix's operation was scheduled for the following week. It happened so fast that Asher felt dizzy, like he had jumped off a cliff and was still waiting to hit the ground. Dante led him through the mansion to a bedroom that was larger than Asher's entire apartment. The bed dominated the space, enormous and covered in black silk sheets that looked like they had never been slept in. Heavy curtains blocked out the storm that still raged outside, creating a space that felt separate from the rest of the world, a bubble where normal rules did not apply and terrible things could happen without consequence. What occurred that night was something Asher tried immediately to forget even as it was happening. Dante was not cruel exactly, but he was not kind either. He was efficient and cold, treating Asher like an obligation to be fulfilled rather than a person with feelings and fears. There were no soft words or gentle touches, no attempt to make the experience anything other than what it was, a transaction between two people who existed in completely different universes and whose paths had crossed only by terrible accident. Asher cried silently into the expensive pillows, his Omega instinct screaming that this was wrong, that heats were supposed to be spent with chosen mates who cared about you, not with alphas who looked at you like you were a problem they needed to solve. When morning finally came, pale light filtering through gaps in the curtains, Dante rose from the bed without a word. He dressed quickly in fresh clothes that had been laid out by invisible servants, his movements precise and controlled like everything else about him. Asher remained where he was, curled up under sheets that smelled overwhelmingly of alpha, his body aching in ways that made him want to disappear into the mattress and never emerge. Dante pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket and tossed it onto the bed beside Asher. It landed with a soft thump that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. "The money for your brother's operation has already been transferred," Dante said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "The additional $5 million is in that envelope in the form of a bank draft. Take it and leave. Use the servant's entrance so no one sees you. Forget this ever happened. Forget you ever met me. If you try to contact me again for any reason, I will have you arrested for extortion. Do you understand?" Asher could not speak. His throat felt like it had been filled with broken glass. He managed a tiny nod, not trusting himself to look at Dante's face because he knew if he did he would start crying again and he had no tears left to give. Dante left without another word, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Asher lay there for a long time, staring at the envelope that represented more money than he had ever seen in his life, money that had been purchased with pieces of himself that he could never get back. Eventually he forced himself to move, to gather his damp clothes from where they had been discarded on the floor, to dress with fingers that would not stop trembling. He took the envelope because he had to, because Felix needed it, because that was the whole point of everything that had just happened. The walk through Blackwood Manor to the servants' entrance was a blur. Asher kept his head down, avoided looking at anyone, and somehow made it outside into the cool morning air that felt like a blessing after the suffocating atmosphere of the mansion. He walked down the hill rather than calling for a ride, needing the time to try to pull himself together before he saw Felix. The next few weeks passed in a haze of relief and grief that Asher could not untangle from each other. Felix's operation was a success, the doctors declaring it a miracle, though of course it was not a miracle at all but rather the result of Asher selling himself to a monster. Felix recovered quickly, his color returning, his energy coming back, until he was laughing and joking like the normal 12-year-old boy he should have been all along. Watching his brother heal should have made Asher happy, and it did, but that happiness was tainted by the knowledge of what it had cost. Asher told Felix and everyone else that he had won a lottery, that luck had finally smiled on them after years of hardship. Felix believed it because he was young and had no reason to suspect his older brother would lie about something so important. Asher used part of the money to pay off all their debts, to move them into a slightly better apartment, to buy Felix new clothes and books and all the things that normal kids took for granted. He put the rest in a savings account where it sat like a reproach, reminding him every time he checked the balance of exactly how it had been earned. But there was something else happening too, something that Asher did not notice at first because he was so focused on Felix's recovery and trying to rebuild their life. He felt tired all the time, a bone-deep exhaustion that did not go away no matter how much he slept. Food started to smell wrong, even his favorite meals turning his stomach. He told himself it was stress, that his body was just recovering from the trauma of that night with Dante, that everything would go back to normal eventually if he just gave it time. 2 months after that terrible night, Asher finally admitted that something was seriously wrong. He had been sick every morning for a week straight, vomiting until there was nothing left in his stomach and then dry heaving over the toilet while Felix knocked worriedly on the bathroom door asking if he was okay. That was when true fear set in, the kind of fear that made his hands shake and his vision blur because he knew what these symptoms meant but could not quite let himself believe it was possible. He went to the free clinic on the other side of town where nobody knew him, where he could slip in and out without attracting attention. The Omega doctor who examined him was named Nova Sterling, a kind woman with gentle hands and eyes that had seen too much suffering. She ran the tests while Asher sat on the examination table, his legs dangling like a child's, praying to every god he had ever heard of that he was wrong, that this was just the flu or food poisoning or anything other than what he suspected. Nova returned with a folder in her hands and an expression on her face that told Asher everything he needed to know before she even opened her mouth. She sat down on the rolling stool and took a deep breath, clearly trying to figure out the best way to deliver news that had no good delivery method. "Asher," she said gently, "you're pregnant. About 8 weeks along based on the hormone levels. She paused, flipping through the test results, and then her eyes widened slightly. Actually, I need to do an ultrasound. There's something unusual in the numbers. Asher felt the world tilt sideways. Pregnant. He was pregnant with Dante Blackwood's child, with a baby of an alpha who had told him to forget they ever met, who had threatened him with arrest if he ever tried to make contact again. This could not be happening. This was not real. He was going to wake up and discover this was all a nightmare brought on by stress and exhaustion. But it was not a nightmare. Nova performed the ultrasound, running the wand over Asher's still flat stomach while he stared at the ceiling and tried not to scream. The sound of heartbeats filled the room, fast and fluttering like bird wings, and Nova made a small sound of surprise. Asher, she said, her voice careful and measured, you're not just pregnant. You're carrying triplets. 3 babies. The world went completely dark around the edges of Asher's vision. He heard Nova calling his name from very far away, felt her hands on his shoulders pushing his head down between his knees so he would not faint, but it all seemed to be happening to someone else. 3 babies. Not 1 but 3. How was that even possible? How could his life have gone from terrible to catastrophic in the span of a single doctor's appointment? When he could breathe again, when the room stopped spinning quite so violently, Asher asked the only question that mattered. What am I going to do? Nova was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, that's your choice, Asher. But you need to make it soon. If you're considering termination, it's safest to do it within the next few weeks. If you're going to continue the pregnancy, you need to start prenatal care immediately. Triplets are high risk, especially for omegas. You'll need regular monitoring, special nutrition, probably bed rest in the later months. Asher thought about Felix, about his brother who was finally healthy and happy and had his whole life ahead of him. He thought about the money in the savings account, money that could support a family if he was careful with it. He thought about Dante's cold silver eyes and harsh words, about how the Alpha had made it clear he wanted nothing to do with Asher ever again. And then he thought about 3 tiny heartbeats, 3 little lives that had not asked to be created but existed nonetheless. I'm keeping them, he heard himself say, and once the words were out he knew they were true. I'm keeping all 3 of them. Nova nodded like she had expected this answer. Then we need to start taking care of you. Do you have support? Family? Friends? The father? No father, Asher said quickly, too quickly, and Nova's expression told him she understood there was a story there but was professional enough not to push. Just me and my brother. But we'll manage. We always do. He left the clinic with a bag full of prenatal vitamins and pamphlets about Omega pregnancy and a follow-up appointment scheduled for 2 weeks later. The walk home felt longer than usual, like his legs had forgotten how to work properly. When he got back to the apartment, Felix was doing homework at the kitchen table, his tongue sticking out slightly in concentration the way it always did when he was working on math problems. Felix looked up and smiled, that bright, uncomplicated smile of a kid who had been saved from death and did not yet understand how cruel the world could be. You're back. I was starting to worry. How was the doctor? Just a checkup, right? Asher forced himself to smile back. Just a checkup. Everything's fine. The lie tasted like ash in his mouth, but he told himself it was not really a lie, not yet, because everything would be fine eventually. It had to be. That night, after Felix went to bed, Asher sat at the kitchen table with his hand pressed against his stomach where 3 impossible babies were growing. He made a promise to them, to these children who did not have a father who wanted them and a mother who was terrified but determined. I will protect you, he whispered into the darkness. I will keep you safe. I will love you enough for 2 parents. And I will never, never let Dante Blackwood hurt you the way he hurt me. The pregnancy was difficult from the start. Asher was sick constantly, his Omega body struggling to support 3 growing lives. He had to cut back his hours at work, which meant less money coming in, but he had the savings from Dante and he stretched every dollar as far as it would go. Nova became not just his doctor but his friend, checking on him between appointments, bringing him special teas that helped with the nausea, offering advice and support that Asher desperately needed. Felix figured out the truth when Asher was about 4 months along and could no longer hide the swell of his belly. His brother's reaction was not what Asher expected. Instead of being angry about the lies, Felix threw his arms around Asher and declared that he was going to be the best uncle in the entire world. That moment, feeling his brother's skinny arms tight around him and hearing the excitement in his voice, was the first time since that terrible night with Dante that Asher felt something like hope. The babies were born on a cold winter morning after 20 hours of labor that left Asher exhausted and shaking but impossibly happy. 3 perfect children, 2 boys and a girl, each weighing just over 5 pounds and screaming with healthy lungs. The nurses placed them on Asher's chest one by one and he fell in love 3 times in the span of minutes, a love so fierce and overwhelming that it erased every doubt he had ever had about his decision to keep them. He named them carefully, choosing names that meant strength and light and hope. The oldest by 2 minutes was Kai, a serious baby who rarely cried and seemed to be taking in everything around him with wise eyes. The middle child was Luna, the only girl, with a sweet disposition and tiny fingers that wrapped around Asher's thumb like she never wanted to let go. The youngest was Storm, who came into the world wailing and had barely stopped since, a bundle of energy and chaos even as a newborn. The first year was the hardest time of Asher's life. Taking care of 3 infants alone while Felix was at school was like trying to fight a war on multiple fronts simultaneously. There was always someone crying, always someone hungry, always diapers to change and bottles to make and 1,000 tiny emergencies that needed immediate attention. Asher survived on 3 hours of sleep a night and caffeine and pure stubborn determination not to fail his children. But slowly, impossibly, it got easier. The babies grew into toddlers who could feed themselves and communicate what they needed. Felix helped more as he got older, changing diapers and reading bedtime stories and playing with his niece and nephews for hours so Asher could take a shower or a nap. Nova visited regularly, bringing hand-me-down clothes and toys and occasionally groceries when she noticed the cupboards getting bare. They built a family out of broken pieces and sheer willpower, and somehow it worked. 5 years had passed since that rainy night at Blackwood Manor, and Asher had built a life that felt almost normal if he did not think too hard about the secret that lived in his children's silver eyes and black hair, a secret that stared back at him every morning when he helped them brush their teeth and every night when he tucked them into bed. The triplets were 5 years old now, kindergarten age, and Asher had managed to secure a job as a teaching assistant at Little Stars Kindergarten on the west side of the city where the pay was modest but steady and where the director had kindly allowed him to enroll his own children at a reduced rate. Kai had grown into a remarkably serious child who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his small shoulders, always watching out for his siblings and often acting more like a protective parent than a 5-year-old. He excelled at puzzles and building blocks and had already taught himself to read simple books by studying the signs and labels around their apartment. Luna was the artist of the family, constantly drawing pictures of flowers and rainbows and families holding hands, her gentle nature making her a favorite among the other children at school. Storm lived up to his name in every possible way, a whirlwind of energy and mischief who could not sit still for more than 30 seconds and who had already earned a reputation as the class troublemaker despite being genuinely kind-hearted beneath all the chaos. Felix was 17 now, a senior in high school who had grown tall and confident, no longer the sickly child who had once been dying in a hospital bed. He worked part-time at a grocery store and helped with the triplets whenever Asher needed him. And though money was still tight they managed to get by without dipping into what remained of the savings from that night Asher tried not to think about. Life was not perfect but it was theirs, built from scratch with love and determination, and Asher had almost convinced himself that Dante Blackwood was nothing more than a bad memory that would eventually fade into insignificance. Then came the announcement that shattered the careful peace Asher had constructed. The director of Little Stars Kindergarten called a special assembly one morning, her face glowing with excitement as she informed the staff and students that they had received a generous donation from Blackwood Industries, one of the largest corporations in the country. The company's owner would be visiting personally to tour the facility and meet the children, and everyone was expected to be on their best behavior to show proper gratitude for this incredible act of philanthropy. Asher felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. Blackwood Industries. Dante Blackwood. The alpha he had spent 5 years trying to forget was coming here, to this school, to the one place in the world where Asher had felt safe. His first instinct was to grab his children and run, to call in sick and hide until the danger passed, but he could not do that without raising questions he was not prepared to answer. So instead he spent the days leading up to the visit in a state of controlled panic, planning escape routes and practicing excuses and praying to every deity that had ever existed that somehow Dante would not notice him among the dozens of staff members and parents who would be present. The day of the visit arrived with cruel sunshine and clear skies, the kind of perfect weather that mocked Asher's internal terror. He dressed the triplets in their nicest clothes, hands shaking as he buttoned Storm's shirt for the third time because the boy kept wiggling and unbuttoning it again. Kai watched him with those two knowing eyes and asked if everything was okay, and Asher lied with a smile and said of course everything was fine, they were just going to meet a very important visitor and needed to make a good impression. The kindergarten had been decorated like they were receiving royalty. Colorful banners hung from the ceiling, the children had made welcome signs covered in glitter and paint, and the director had baked cookies that filled the building with the warm smell of sugar and vanilla. Parents and staff gathered in the main hall, children bouncing with excitement because they had been told a very rich man was coming to see them and might bring presents. Asher positioned himself at the very back of the crowd, keeping the triplets close and trying to make himself as small and invisible as possible. His heart hammered against his ribs so hard he thought everyone around him must be able to hear it. Any minute now Dante would walk through those doors and Asher's entire carefully constructed world would come crashing down around his ears. The doors opened and there he was, looking exactly the same as he had 5 years ago except perhaps even more imposing in an expensive gray suit that probably cost more than Asher earned in 6 months. Dante Blackwood strode into the kindergarten like he owned it, which in a sense he now did, his silver eyes sweeping across the assembled crowd with an expression of polite disinterest. He was flanked by several assistants carrying clipboards and tablets, and by a man Asher did not recognize, someone who stayed close to Dante's side and whispered things in his ear that made the alpha nod or frown. The director rushed forward to greet him, pumping his hand enthusiastically and gushing about how grateful they all were for his generosity. Dante smiled but it did not reach his eyes, the same cold smile Asher remembered from that night, the smile of someone going through the motions of being human without actually feeling anything. He let the director lead him on a tour of the facility, stopping to look at the children's artwork on the walls and nodding at the explanations of various educational programs. Asher kept moving, always staying on the opposite side of the room from where Dante was, using other people as shields and keeping his head down. The triplets were getting restless, Storm especially fidgeting and whining that he was bored and wanted to go play. Asher shushed him desperately, trying to keep them all quiet and unnoticed, just a little longer, just until Dante left and they could breathe again. But then Storm broke free from Asher's grip and ran directly toward Dante before Asher could stop him. The little boy had spotted something shiny on one of the assistant's tablets and with the single-minded determination of a 5-year-old who wanted to see something interesting, he dodged through the crowd and crashed directly into Dante's legs. Time seemed to stop. Dante looked down at the small child who had attached himself to his knees, surprise flickering across his face. Storm looked up at the tall alpha and announced in a voice that carried across the entire room, "You're really tall. And pretty. Are you a prince?" Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Dante's expression softened slightly and he crouched down to Storm's level, bringing himself eye to eye with the boy. "Not a prince," he said, his deep voice gentle in a way Asher had never heard it before. "Just a businessman. What's your name?" "I'm Storm. And that's my sister Luna and my brother Kai. We're triplets, which means we were all born at the same time, which is really cool." Storm pointed back toward where his siblings stood, and Dante's gaze followed the gesture. Asher watched in horror as Dante's eyes landed first on Luna, who was clutching Kai's hand and looking worried about her brother's boldness, and then on Kai, who stared back at Dante with an intensity that was unsettling in such a young child. Asher saw the exact moment when recognition hit, when Dante's brain processed what his eyes were seeing. 3 children, all with black hair the same shade as his own, all with silver eyes that were unmistakably alpha genetics even though they were far too young to have presented yet. Dante stood up slowly, his face gone completely blank in a way that was somehow more terrifying than anger would have been. His eyes swept the crowd again, no longer disinterested but searching, and then they locked on Asher. For a moment neither of them moved, caught in a stare that held 5 years of secrets and lies and consequences neither of them had anticipated. The director was still talking, oblivious to the tension crackling in the air like electricity before a lightning strike. She was saying something about the children's choir performing a special song, but her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. Dante cut her off mid-sentence with a raised hand, his eyes never leaving Asher's face. "I need to speak with that man," Dante said, pointing directly at Asher. "Now. Privately." The crowd turned to look at Asher, confusion and curiosity on their faces. The director looked flustered, clearly not understanding why her important donor was suddenly demanding a private meeting with a lowly teaching assistant. "I'm sure that can be arranged later, Mr. Blackwood, but perhaps we could continue the tour first and then—" "Now," Dante repeated, and there was steel in his voice that made it clear this was not a request. "Unless you would prefer I withdraw my donation entirely." That got the director moving. She hurried over to Asher and whispered urgently that he should go with Mr. Blackwood to the small office down the hall, that whatever he had done wrong he needed to fix it immediately because they could not afford to lose this funding. Asher wanted to refuse, wanted to grab his children and run, but Kai was already pulling Luna and Storm back toward him and there was nowhere to run anyway. Dante knew. The secret was out. Running would only make things worse. Asher handed the triplets over to another teacher, a kind woman named Martha who promised to keep them occupied with a movie. The children protested, especially Kai who seemed to sense something was wrong, but Asher forced a smile and told them he would be right back. Then he followed Dante and the director down the hallway to a tiny office that was usually used for parent-teacher conferences, his legs moving automatically because his brain had shut down from sheer terror. The director started to follow them into the office but Dante stopped her with another look, the kind of look that made it clear her presence was not required or welcome. She retreated with obvious reluctance, closing the door behind her and leaving Asher alone with the alpha whose children he had hidden for 5 years. The office was barely big enough for 2 people. A small desk took up most of the space with 2 chairs squeezed in on either side. Dante did not sit. He stood with his back to the door, blocking the only exit, his hands clenched into fists at his sides like he was physically restraining himself from doing something violent. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and dangerous and vibrating with barely controlled rage. "Those children. Are they mine?" Asher could have lied. He could have claimed they were from another alpha, could have tried to deny the obvious truth that was written in every feature of the triplets' faces. But he was so tired of lying, so tired of carrying this secret alone, and some small part of him was almost relieved that it was finally out in the open. "Yes," he said simply. "They're yours." Dante's fists clenched tighter. 5 years. You kept my children from me for 5 years. You never told me they existed. You let me believe that night meant nothing, produced nothing, and all this time I had 3 children I knew nothing about. Anger flared in Asher's chest, hot and righteous, burning through the fear. You told me to forget that night ever happened. You threw money at me and said if I ever contacted you again you would have me arrested. What exactly did you expect me to do? Show up at your mansion with triplets and hope you suddenly decided to care? I had a right to know. Dante's voice rose despite his obvious efforts to keep it controlled. Regardless of what I said, regardless of how that night ended, those are my children and I had a right to know they existed. Rights? Asher laughed bitterly. You want to talk about rights? You used me like I was nothing, treated me like garbage, and then tossed me aside the moment you were done. You don't get to talk about rights when you made it perfectly clear I was just a transaction to you. They stared at each other across the tiny office, both breathing hard, years of unspoken pain and anger spilling out in harsh whispers because even in fury they were aware of the thin walls and listening ears just outside. Dante ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration that made him look almost human for a moment. What are their names? He asked finally, his voice quieter now but still tight with emotion. Kai, Luna, and Storm, Asher said. Kai is the oldest by 2 minutes, then Luna, then Storm. They're smart and kind and perfect and they don't need an alpha who will only hurt them. You don't get to make that decision alone anymore, Dante said. They're my children too whether you like it or not. I want to be part of their lives. I want them to know who their father is. Asher felt panic rising again. No. No, absolutely not. You can't just waltz in after 5 years and decide you want to play daddy. They don't know you. You'll confuse them, hurt them, and then you'll get bored and disappear, and I'll be left to pick up the pieces of their broken hearts. I'm not asking for your permission, Dante said coldly. I'm telling you how this is going to work. I will get to know my children. I will be part of their lives. And if you try to stop me, I have lawyers who can tie you up in court for years and make your life a living nightmare. The threat hung between them, ugly and real. Asher knew Dante had the power to do exactly what he claimed. He had unlimited money and resources and influence, while Asher had nothing except his love for his children and a desperate need to protect them from harm. Before Asher could respond, before this confrontation could escalate any further, there was a commotion outside the office. Raised voices, someone crying, and then the door burst open and Kai stood there, his small face set in determined lines. "Leave my daddy alone," the boy shouted, his little hands balled into fists. "You're making him sad and I won't let you." Behind Kai, Martha the teacher appeared, looking mortified. "I'm so sorry, he just ran off before I could stop him. He was very determined to find you, Asher. I couldn't." But Kai was already crossing the office to throw his arms around Asher's waist, pressing his face against his father's stomach. Luna and Storm appeared in the doorway too, Luna crying and Storm looking confused and upset because his siblings were upset. They all converged on Asher, surrounding him with their small warm bodies, creating a wall of protection around the parent they loved. Dante watched this scene unfold, his expression unreadable. He looked at his children clinging to Asher, at the way they formed a united front against him, at the love and trust that was evident in every line of their bodies. Something shifted in his face, something that might have been pain or regret or the beginning of understanding how badly he had miscalculated everything. "We'll finish this conversation later," Dante said quietly. He moved toward the door, then paused and looked back. "But this isn't over, Asher. Not by a long shot. Those children deserve to know both their parents, and I'm going to make sure they get that chance whether you cooperate or not." He left, his assistants scrambling to follow him, and suddenly the kindergarten tour was over and black cars were pulling away from the curb. Asher sank into one of the office chairs, still surrounded by his children, and tried to figure out how his life had just completely imploded in the span of 20 minutes. The triplets peppered him with questions. Who was that man? Why was he making Daddy upset? Was Daddy in trouble? Asher answered as best he could with vague reassurances that everything was fine, that the man was just a visitor who wanted to talk about boring grown-up things, that there was nothing for them to worry about. The lies came easily now after years of practice, but they tasted worse than ever. That night, after the children were finally asleep in their shared bedroom, Asher sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands while Felix made tea neither of them really wanted. His brother had gotten the full story in whispered fragments, and now he sat across from Asher looking worried and angry in equal measure. "What are you going to do?" Felix asked. "Can he really take the kids away? Does he have legal rights?" Asher did not know. He had never looked into the legalities because he had never expected Dante to find out, had never planned for this scenario. "I need to talk to a lawyer," he said. "But lawyers cost money we don't have, and Dante has unlimited resources. If this becomes a custody battle, I'll lose. I know I'll lose." "Then don't let it become a custody battle," Felix said. "Find a way to work with him. I know you hate him and you have every right to, but those kids deserve better than watching their parents fight over them in court." Asher knew his brother was right, but the thought of cooperating with Dante, of allowing that cold heartless alpha access to his precious children, made him feel physically ill. Still, what choice did he have? Dante had made his intentions clear. He was coming for his children one way or another, and Asher could either participate in how that happened or be steamrolled in the process. 3 days later, a lawyer showed up at Asher's apartment with papers that outlined Dante's proposal. The alpha wanted joint custody, wanted the children on weekends, wanted to pay child support retroactively for the 5 years he had missed. The numbers on those papers made Asher's head spin, more money than he had ever imagined, enough to ensure the triplets would want for nothing for the rest of their lives. But Asher did not want Dante's money. He wanted his children safe and happy and free from the influence of an alpha who treated people like objects to be used and discarded. The lawyer explained patiently that Asher could refuse these terms and go to court, but that given the circumstances, given that he had deliberately hidden the children's existence from their father for 5 years, the court would almost certainly rule in Dante's favor and possibly give him even more access than he was currently requesting. Asher signed the papers because he had no choice, his hand shaking so badly the signature was nearly illegible. The lawyer left with promises that arrangements would be made, that Dante would start with supervised visits before transitioning to overnight stays, that everything would be handled professionally and with the children's best interests at heart. That night Asher had to explain to 3 confused 5-year-olds that the tall man from the kindergarten was actually their other parent, that they had a papa as well as a daddy, and that they would be spending time with him starting this weekend. Kai's reaction was immediate suspicion and refusal, declaring that he did not want another parent and that Asher was enough. Luna cried because she was overwhelmed by the sudden change to their routine. Only Storm seemed excited, bouncing around the living room and asking if their new papa was really as rich as the other kids at school said, and did that mean they might get to live in a mansion. The first visit was scheduled for Saturday afternoon. Dante arrived in his usual black car, driven by a chauffeur because apparently the man never drove himself anywhere. Asher watched from the window as the alpha climbed out, dressed more casually than Asher had ever seen him in dark jeans and a simple button-down shirt, clearly making an effort to appear less intimidating. The triplets were dressed and ready, though Kai had crossed his arms and announced he was not going anywhere with a stranger. It took 20 minutes of coaxing and bribing before Asher could get all 3 children out the door. Dante stood on the sidewalk looking uncomfortable and uncertain, clearly out of his element when faced with 3 small children who viewed him with varying degrees of suspicion and curiosity. "Hello," Dante said, crouching down to their level the way he had at the kindergarten. "I'm Dante. Your papa. I know this is strange and confusing, but I'm very happy to meet you properly. All of you." Storm immediately launched into a series of questions about the car and whether Dante lived in a castle and if he had any pets. Luna hid behind Asher's legs, peeking out at this new person with wide eyes. Kai just stared, his expression so serious and evaluating that he looked like a tiny judge rendering verdict on a criminal. They spent 2 hours at a park, Dante attempting to engage with children who barely knew him while supervised by a social worker who took notes on everything. Storm warmed up quickly, dragging Dante from the swings to the slide to the climbing structure with endless energy. Luna eventually emerged from her shell enough to show Dante a flower she had picked, accepting his compliment on her find with a shy smile. Kai remained distant, answering questions in monosyllables and watching Dante with those knowing eyes that seemed to see right through every attempt at connection. When the visit ended and Dante brought the children back, he and Asher stood on the sidewalk in awkward silence while the triplets ran inside to tell Felix about their afternoon. Dante looked tired, like spending 2 hours with 3 5-year-olds had exhausted him more than running his billion-dollar company. "They're wonderful," Dante said quietly. "You've done an amazing job raising them." Asher did not know how to respond to that, coming from the man who had done nothing to help raise them. "They're good kids," he said finally. "And they're fragile. If you hurt them, if you make promises you don't keep, if you decide this is too much work and you want out, I will never forgive you." Dante met his eyes and for the first time Asher saw something in that silver gaze that might have been genuine emotion. "I'm not going anywhere," the alpha said. "I missed 5 years. I won't miss any more." Over the following months, Dante proved he meant what he said. He showed up for every scheduled visit, never late, never canceling. He learned the children's likes and dislikes, their favorite foods and books and games. He was patient with Kai's continued suspicion, gentle with Luna's shyness, and energetic enough to keep up with Storm's chaos. Slowly, impossibly, the children began to accept him as a real presence in their lives rather than just a strange man who sometimes took them to parks. But Asher watched all this with a heart full of conflict. Part of him was relieved that Dante was trying, that the children were getting the chance to know their other parent. But another part, the part that still remembered that cold morning when Dante had thrown money at him and told him to forget they ever met, could not quite believe this change was real or permanent. Then came the day that changed everything again. Asher received a call from an unknown number while he was at work. The voice on the other end identified himself as Silas Gray, Dante's best friend and business partner. Asher had never met the man but had heard his name mentioned during Dante's visits with the children. "We need to meet," Silas said without preamble. "I have information about Dante that you need to know before you let him any deeper into your children's lives. Information that will change everything you think you know about what happened 6 years ago." Asher's blood ran cold. "What kind of information?" "The kind that explains why Dante treated you the way he did that night," Silas said. "And the kind that proves he's not the man he's pretending to be now. Meet me tomorrow at the coffee shop on 5th Street at 3 o'clock. Come alone. What I have to show you could save your children from making a terrible mistake in trusting their father." The call ended before Asher could ask more questions. He stood in the kindergarten classroom surrounded by building blocks and finger paintings, his phone still pressed to his ear, and wondered if he was about to discover that the fragile piece they had built was all based on lies. The next day, Asher met Silas at the designated coffee shop. The man was handsome in a polished way, with perfect hair and expensive clothes and a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He had a folder with him, thick with papers and photographs, and he slid it across the table to Asher without ceremony. "Everything you need to know is in there," Silas said. "Dante Blackwood is a monster who destroys everything he touches. He hurt you 6 years ago and he'll hurt your children now if you let him. These documents prove it." Asher opened the folder with shaking hands and started to read, his world tilting sideways for what felt like the 100th time since that rainy night that had started all of this. The papers detailed business dealings that seemed questionable at best and illegal at worst, photographs of Dante with various Omegas who all looked used and discarded, testimony from former employees who claimed abuse and manipulation. But something felt wrong about all of it. The evidence was almost too perfect, too comprehensive, like someone had spent a lot of time and effort compiling it all. And when Asher looked closer at the dates on some of the photographs, he realized they were from years ago, long before he had ever met Dante, and that some of them had clearly been edited or taken out of context. "Why are you showing me this?" Asher asked, looking up at Silas with new suspicion. Silas's smile widened, but it was cold and cruel. "Because I've loved Dante for 10 years and watched him ignore me. Then you came along and suddenly he cares about something other than money and power. You and those brats have taken everything that should have been mine. So I'm taking it all back. Starting with destroying any trust you might have been building with him." Asher stood up abruptly, clutching the folder. "You're lying. This is all fake." "Some of it is fake," Silas admitted cheerfully. "Some of it is real but irrelevant. Some of it is real and damning. Good luck figuring out which is which. By the time you do, I'll have already poisoned any chance of you and Dante building a real family together." Asher left the coffee shop feeling sick and confused. He went home and looked through the folder more carefully, trying to separate truth from manipulation. Felix helped him research some of the claims online, and together they slowly began to realize that while Dante's past was far from perfect, most of what Silas had provided was either outright fabrication or gross exaggeration of minor incidents blown out of proportion. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and doubt grew into suspicion, and suspicion made Asher question every interaction with Dante over the past months. Had the alpha really changed, or was he just a good actor? Were his feelings for the children genuine or just another way to exert control? Asher found himself pulling back, being colder during exchanges, questioning Dante's motives for everything. Dante noticed the change immediately. He asked what was wrong, if he had done something to upset Asher, but Asher could not bring himself to explain about Silas or the folder or the confusion that was eating him alive. So he just said everything was fine and watched as hurt flickered across Dante's face, hurt that the alpha tried to hide but could not quite manage. The situation came to a head 3 weeks later when Dante showed up for his usual weekend visit and Kai refused to go with him. The boy crossed his arms and announced that he had heard Asher crying on the phone to Felix about how someone was trying to hurt their family, and he had decided that Dante must be the one responsible because he was the only new person in their lives. Dante looked stricken. He knelt down and tried to explain to Kai that he would never hurt any of them, that he loved them all, but Kai was 5 years old and operating on 5-year-old logic, and he had made up his mind. Luna and Storm, taking their cue from their older brother, also refused to go. After the children ran back inside, Dante turned to Asher with devastation written all over his face. "What did Silas tell you?" he asked quietly. Asher's eyes widened. "How did you?" "Because I know him," Dante said bitterly. "I've known him for years and I know how his mind works. He's been in love with me forever and he's jealous of you and the children. He would absolutely try to sabotage this." "What did he show you?" Asher hesitated, then went inside and retrieved the folder. He handed it to Dante without a word. The Alpha flipped through it, his expression growing darker with each page, until finally he threw the whole thing down on the porch steps. "Half of this is completely fabricated," Dante said, his voice shaking with anger. "The photographs are doctored or from contexts that have nothing to do with what he's implying. The business allegations were investigated years ago and found to be baseless rumors started by competitors. And yes, I had relationships with other Omegas before you, but they were all consensual adults and none of them ended the way he's suggesting." "But some of it is true," Asher said. "Some of these things you really did." "Yes," Dante admitted. "Some of it is true. I was not a good person 6 years ago. I was cold and calculating and I treated people badly, including you. But that's exactly why I'm trying so hard now to be different, to be better, to be the father my children deserve and the partner you deserved 6 years ago." They stood there on the porch, years of pain and misunderstanding and manipulation sitting between them like a physical presence. Then Dante did something Asher never expected. He got down on his knees right there on the wooden boards, not caring who might see, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," Dante said, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry for what I did to you 6 years ago. I'm sorry I was too broken and scared to see what I was throwing away. I'm sorry I took our children from you even temporarily when Silas showed me fake evidence against you. I'm sorry for every moment of pain I've caused you and I'm begging you to give me a chance to make it right." Asher felt his own tears falling. "You hurt me so badly. Both times. How am I supposed to trust that you won't do it again?" "I can't promise I won't make mistakes," Dante said. "I'm still learning how to be a parent and how to care about someone other than myself. But I can promise that I will never deliberately hurt you or the children again. I can promise that I'm here for the long haul, not because I have to be but because I want to be. And I can promise that I love you, Asher Moon. I think I've loved you since that first night, I was just too much of a coward to admit it." Asher's heart felt like it was being torn in two. Part of him wanted to pull Dante up and forgive everything, to believe in second chances and redemption and love conquering all. But another part remembered the pain too clearly, remembered the cold morning and the cruel words and the 5 years of struggling alone. "I need time," Asher finally said. "I need time to process all of this, to figure out what I feel, to make sure I'm making the right choice for my children and not just reacting to emotions." Dante nodded and stood up, wiping at his eyes. "I'll give you all the time you need. But please don't let Silas win. Don't let his lies destroy what we're building here." After Dante left, Asher went inside and found all 3 children sitting on the couch looking worried. Kai spoke first, his little voice trembling. "Did we make Papa sad?" "I didn't want to make him sad. I just wanted to protect you." Asher gathered all 3 of them into his arms, holding them close. "You didn't do anything wrong, sweetheart. Grown-ups sometimes have complicated problems and we're working through them. But I need you to know something important. Your papa loves you very much. All 3 of you. And even though things are confusing right now, we're going to figure it out." The next weeks were a blur of reflection and research and soul-searching. Asher talked to Nova, who pointed out that Dante had been nothing but consistent and reliable for months now. He talked to Felix, who said that people could change if they really wanted to. He even hired a lawyer to investigate the claims in Silas's folder, and every single one came back as either false or wildly exaggerated. But the real turning point came when Storm got sick with a high fever that spiked to dangerous levels in the middle of the night. Asher called an ambulance in a panic, and somehow in the chaos he also called Dante without really thinking about it. The Alpha arrived at the hospital before the ambulance did, having broken every traffic law to get there, and he stayed by Storm's bedside all night while doctors worked to bring down the fever. When Storm finally stabilized in the early morning hours, Asher and Dante found themselves sitting side by side in uncomfortable hospital chairs, holding hands without remembering when they had reached for each other. "Thank you for calling me," Dante said quietly. "Thank you for letting me be here. Asher looked at their joined hands, at the way Dante's thumb was absently stroking across his knuckles, and realized that somewhere along the way his heart had started to heal. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough to let in the possibility of forgiveness and hope. "I think I'm ready to try," Asher said. "Really try. Not just for the kids but for us." Dante turned to look at him, hope and disbelief and joy all mixing together on his face. "Are you sure? I don't want you to feel pressured or obligated. I just want you to be happy." "I'm sure," Asher said, and for the first time in a long time it felt like the truth. "You've proven over the past months that you've really changed. You show up. You keep your promises. You love our children and you've been patient with me even when I didn't deserve it. I'm not saying everything is perfect or that I've forgotten what happened. But I'm willing to move forward." They sat there in the hospital waiting room as dawn light began to filter through the windows, still holding hands, and made promises to each other about trying harder and communicating better and building a real family together out of the broken pieces they had started with. Silas's plan had backfired spectacularly. When Dante confronted him about the fake evidence and the attempt to manipulate Asher, Silas broke down and confessed everything. He had been working for months to sabotage Dante's relationship with his children and with Asher, driven by jealousy and unrequited love that had turned toxic. Dante immediately severed all business and personal ties, and when it came out that Silas had also been embezzling from their company to fund his schemes, legal action followed swiftly. Silas ended up facing charges for fraud and manipulation, his reputation destroyed and his freedom taken away. A year later, Asher and Dante stood in front of a small group of family and friends, exchanging vows that promised love and partnership and commitment to building a life together. The triplets were their flower children, all three of them dressed in matching outfits that Luna had helped pick out, throwing petals with varying degrees of enthusiasm and accuracy. Felix gave Asher away, tears streaming down his face as he hugged his older brother and whispered that their mother would have been proud. Nova stood as Asher's best friend, beaming with joy and maybe just a little bit of "I told you this would work out" smugness. And when Dante kissed Asher at the end of the ceremony, the triplets all cheered and Storm shouted, "You gross," loudly enough to make everyone laugh. They bought a house together, not a mansion but a real home with a yard where the children could play and a kitchen big enough for family dinners and bedrooms for everyone, including one for Felix, who was now in college and studying to become a social worker. Kai was 6 now and had decided he wanted to be a lawyer when he grew up so he could protect people who needed help. Luna had covered half the walls in their new house with her artwork. Storm had convinced them to get a puppy that proceeded to cause chaos on a daily basis but that the whole family loved anyway. Asher learned that real strength was not about doing everything alone but about being brave enough to accept help and love from others. Dante learned that the things that mattered most in life could not be bought or controlled, only earned through patience and genuine care. Together they learned that family was messy and complicated and required constant work, but that it was worth every difficult moment. On their first wedding anniversary, Dante woke Asher before dawn and led him out to the porch where they could watch the sunrise together. "Thank you," Dante whispered, pulling Asher close. "Thank you for giving me a second chance. Thank you for our beautiful children. Thank you for teaching me how to love." Asher smiled and kissed him softly. "Thank you for becoming the person I could love. Thank you for proving that people really can change." From inside the house came the sound of small feet thundering downstairs and 3 voices calling for their daddies to come make breakfast because they were starving. Asher and Dante looked at each other and laughed, then went inside to start another day in their perfectly imperfect life together. The end. If you enjoyed this story of betrayal, healing, and second chances, please like, subscribe, and share with others who love emotional romance tales. Leave a comment below telling us what you thought of Asher and Dante's journey, and let us know what kind of story you would like to hear next. Thank you for listening, and remember that everyone deserves a second chance to become the person they were meant to be.